Good day, class. Let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 2, the biology of behavior. Biology, behavior, and mind. Humans are biopsychosocial systems. Understanding behavior requires study of interactions among biological, psychological, and social systems. Biological psychologists use advanced technologies to study these links. Neuroplasticity makes the human brain unique. Biology and experience interact to facilitate new pathways as the brain changes and adapts to a changing world. We'll see a little bit later how powerful plasticity can be. There's a video on this as well. A video describing how someone can have half their brain removed and still be able to function. I want to take the moment here to also note there are numerous videos for this section. Please view these videos. They'll help to solidify the knowledge and your learning in this material. Here's some terms that we want to cover for neural communication. Neuron, a nerve cell, the basic building block of the nervous system. Cell body, part of the neuron that contains the nucleus, the cell's life support center. Dendrites, neurons often bushy, tree-like, branching extensions that receive and integrate messages, conducting impulses toward the cell body. Axon, a neuron extension that passes messages through its branches. Myelin sheath, fatty tissue layer segmentally encasing the axons of some neurons. It enables vastly greater transmission speed as neural impulses hop from one node to the next. Also want to note this. The myelin sheath is also partly responsible for a particular disorder that you may be familiar with. MS, multiple sclerosis. It is the deterioration of the fatty tissue of myelin sheaths that cover some of the axons, which of course will make movement and coordinated movement much more difficult to do for people who are suffering from this particular disease. Glial cells, cells in the nervous system that support, nourish, and protect neurons. They may also play a role in learning, thinking, and memory. And action potential, a neural impulse, a brief electrical charge that travels down an axon. It should be noted now that the neural communication involves two processes basically. An electrical process and a chemical process. We'll be examining first the electrical part of this electrical chemical process of neural communication. Here's the graph. You'll see this displayed in several of the videos that you should be watching in this section. Cell body, the dendrites, the axon, the terminal branches at the end of the axon, which will contain neurotransmitters that will be released to go to other dendrites of adjacent neurons. Now, point to make here. Neurons never ever touch. They never touch. There's always going to be a small gap between neurons. This gap is called the synapse. Because electricity cannot flow across a gap, there needs to be another way for messages to be sent from one neuron to another. So basically what that process is a chemical process. In the terminal branches of the axon, there are these vesicles that contain chemicals or neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are released that travel across the gap, the synapse, and then land on dendrites of adjacent neurons. The neural impulse or action potential. We have this electrical firing. The fires changes down the axon when stimulated. There's a stimulation and then electrical charge happens. The electricity is generated from the chemical events. Ions, electrically charged atoms, are exchanged in and out of the neuron. There's going to be an inhibitory or excitatory signals. Basically, neurons say fire or don't fire. That's all they do, fire or don't fire. They only ignite or do something once a certain threshold has been released. Then there's a refractory period or a rest period. Once a neuron has fired, there's a certain amount of time that must elapse before it will have the ability to be stimulated again and to be fired. And then we have another quality, something called the all or non response. When a neuron fires, it fires the same way, exactly the same every single time. It does not overfire or underfire. It fires exactly the same. It fires the same way every single time. So let's take a closer look at the next slide. So in this slide, we see a axon, and we see sodium ions. We see plus symbols and negative symbols. We see an exchange of these charged particles going in and out. Once stimulation has occurred, as you can see in the graph in the upper right, the threshold has been met, then there will be a spike. The action potential or the electric charge fires to that degree plus 40 every single time, and then it comes down. Then we have the refractory period that will happen, so it cannot fire until it has rested enough and is ready to be charged again. Bodily sensations and actions, detecting a hug or kicking a soccer ball, happen when our neurons are stimulated enough that their membrane's electrical charge reaches a threshold. This prompts each of those neurons to fire an impulse or an action potential that travels down the axon and transmits a message to other neurons, muscles, and glands. Now, how neurotransmitters influence motions and emotions. As I stated earlier, we have this electrochemical process of neural communication. The electrical parts taking part inside the neuron. We see the change in polarity. We see the electrical impulse traveling down the axon, going through the terminal branches, then releasing the neurotransmitter. How do neurotransmitters influence motions and emotions? We have acetylcholine, plays a role in learning and memory. Messenger between motor neurons and skeletal muscles. We have endorphins, naturally occurring opiates produced in the brain. In fact, as you see in one of your videos this chapter, that the brain is a big chemical factory. It produces lots of chemicals. One of these is endorphins. This is an opiate. This is like morphine, but our body produces it for ourselves. So when we get injured, hurt, this is released to help us deal with the pain. We also get a release of endorphins when we do things like running, exercising. We feel good after we do a lot of physical activity. You may have heard of the term a runner's high. A runner's high, they've run a long distance, they're breathing heavy, but they feel good. And one of the reasons they feel good is because the body has pumped their body full of endorphins. How drugs and other chemicals alter neurotransmitter? We have the antagonist and agonist. An agonist molecule increases neurotransmitter action. Antagonist molecules decrease neurotransmitter action. So we can receive drugs that will either increase or enhance our naturally occurring neurotransmitters, or antagonists that will decrease the effectiveness of our naturally occurring neurotransmitters. This next table, Table 3.1, provides an overview of key neurotransmitters and their effects. So remember, we've talked about the electrical process already that goes on in the neuron. And then we have these neurotransmitters that are released out of the terminal branches of the axons across the synapse that have an influence elsewhere, body, gland, muscles, or other neurons. So we have acetylcholine, we have dopamine, influences movement, learning, attention, and emotion. Sometimes when we have an oversupply of dopamine, it has been linked to schizophrenia. Undersupply has been linked to tremors and decreased mobility, as in Parkinson's disease. We have serotonin, which we will talk about quite a bit. Serotonin affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. An undersupply is linked to depression. Some drugs that raise serotonin levels are used to treat depression. You've heard of drugs such as Paxil and Zoloft. These are called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the basic premise is this: they've discovered that when you have large amounts of serotonin or good amounts of serotonin active in your brain, people tend to be less depressed. So they have drugs now to do certain things to the body so that serotonin can be more active for longer periods of time. We have norepinephrine, GABA, glutamate, and endorphins, which we've already talked about. All of these are neurotransmitters and have certain specific functions. Now, how neurons communicate. So we talked about the synapse. The synapse is the junction between the axon tip of the sending neuron and the dendrite or cell body of the receiving neuron. The tiny gap at this junction, the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft, there are other terms for it. We have to get by that little gap in order to communicate, to send our message to the other side. The neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that cross the synaptic gap between neurons. When released by the sending neuron, neurotransmitters travel across the synapse and bind to receptor sites on the receiving neuron, thereby influencing whether the neuron will generate a neural impulse. Now, this is the important part. So we have this electrical impulse traveling down the axon, going to the terminal branches of the axon. This terminal branches contain in these vessels, these little sacs inside, chemicals, neurotransmitters. They stimulate the release of the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter then goes across the gap, the synaptic gap, and lands on receptor sites of the receiving neuron, for example, so that the dendrite, it's going to be a dendrite, so axon to dendrite, axon, gap, then dendrite. The neurotransmitter, like a lock and key, lands on the receptor site of the receiving neuron, and the process begins again. Once that has occurred, once it has done its job, the neurotransmitter is just sitting there. So what the body does next is they perform what is known as reuptake. The reuptake, all the neurotransmitter is reabsorbed by the sending neuron. So it takes it back into itself. Now, I described real briefly just a few minutes ago SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Paxil, Zoloft, those types of drugs which are SSRIs, what they do is they stop the reuptake process. They prevent it from occurring or slow it down so that serotonin stays active in your brain for longer periods of time, thus making the person who's taking the drug less depressed. So that gives you a basic idea of how the neuron is working. This electrical part of the neuron and this chemical part of the neuron. Again, there are several video segments that you can watch in this particular module to examine more closely how this system works and understand it more solidly and make sure your learning of the material is on solid foundation. Now, let's look at a bigger picture. So we've talked about the building blocks here. We went really small and talked about neurons, the building blocks of the nervous system. Now let's talk about the nervous system. The nervous system is an electrochemical communication network consisting of all the nerve cells of the peripheral and central nervous system. As you can see in the graph, the central nervous system is very brief. It's made up of the brain and the spinal cord. They exist in the center of the body, ergo the central nervous system. Then we have the peripheral nervous system outside of the central nervous system. Okay, so this communication network takes information from the world and the body's tissue, makes decision, and sends back information in orders to the body. So the basic premise is going to be this. There's also things going on in the environment around you. There needs to be some way for you to get information about the world around you into your brain so that you can make decisions about it. That's what the nervous system in part does. It has systems so it can bring information in, send it to your brain. You can then make decisions based on that information, and then you send instructions out and orders out to the rest of your body to do this. to run from the truck as you're crossing the road that's speeding up at you. That is what the purpose is of this nervous system, to get information and so you can make proper decisions and take proper actions. So the three neuron types. We have sensory neurons carrying information from the body's tissues and sensory receptors to the brain and spinal cord. We have motor neurons carrying outgoing information from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles and glands. And we have interneurons, our neurons within the brain and spinal cord. They communicate internally and process information between the sensory inputs and motor outputs. Now let's look at the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system, as I stated, is the central part of the body. It is the brain and the spinal cord. Primary information highway for us to make the decisions and get information into us. The peripheral nervous system, the PNS, sensory and motor neurons that connect the central nervous system to the rest of the body. We have the somatic system, which enables voluntary skeletal muscle control, and the autonomic nervous system that controls glands and internal organs. So let's look first at the automatic nervous system. The somatic system, we are familiar with that quite readily because we control that. We make our hands clap. We run. We are under control of those skeletal muscles, for example. The autonomic nervous system is not. We don't control it. All right? Sympathetic nervous system arouses and expends energy. The parasympathetic nervous system conserves energy as it calms and maintains homeostasis or natural balance. Let's talk about this real quickly. The sympathetic nervous system is arousing. It is there to get us going, to rev us up for some action that we need to take. You may be familiar with it. You've heard, I'm sure, of flight or fight response. A fight or flight response. It is a decision that your body must make when you find yourself in a certain situation. So, for example, you're on vacation, you need to go get some money out of the ATM. It's late at night, you don't want to have the money for the next day, so you stay in the ATM machine, you get out of your car, so walk up, you go there, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, as you're getting your money out, you hear some voices behind you say, "Give me your money." When you hear something like that and you feel that stuff that's happening in your body, that is your sympathetic nervous system coming online. What will happen is it will prepare your body. Your pupils will dilate. Your heart will accelerate. Your stomach will stop digesting the Big Mac you just ate earlier. Your adrenal gland will secrete epinephrine or norepinephrine. Your bladder may tend to relax. Lots of things will happen. But what's basically happening is this. Your pupils dilate so you can see more, get more information that you need in this situation. Your heart is pumping and you're breathing heavily. Your heart is pumping to get blood through your body parts. You're breathing fast and more rapidly and deeply to get oxygen in that blood to your body parts. And the basic premise with fight or flight is this. Your body's being prepared, but you can make the decision either way. Stand your ground and fight, or run. Fight or flight. So this is basically your body being in a red alert scenario. Red alert, there's an emergency going on. Get yourself ready for fight or flight. But we can't maintain ourselves in fight or flight for too long. It can be very stressful to the body. Once the emergency is over, then the parasympathetic system comes online. The parasympathetic nervous system will conserve energy as it calms and maintains. It gets everything riled down, turns it down that was turned up by the sympathetic nervous system. That happens without us. So that's one of the key things. This autonomic system happens without us having to take control over it. It does it for us automatically. We're designed to respond in that manner. So the central nervous system, real quickly here, the CNS, the brain, neural networks, neuron work groups, and group clusters. All right, we have the spinal cord, two-way system of ascending and descending neural fibers, and we have reflexes, spinal reflex, pathway, and pain reflex. So, as you're aware, when you go to the doctor, sometimes they'll do the knee tap thing to test your reflexes, because they should, when you tap your knee a certain place, you need to have that kick response. By them doing that, they're able to ascertain if there's anything that's going on that needs to be of concern with your body's nervous system. A sluggish response or no response may indicate one of several issues that your doctor may want to examine. Now, I want to point out another thing here. We don't always send all information up to the brain necessarily for us to make a decision as to what to do. We'll see this in particular when we go to the next chapter, chapter 3. We'll talk about consciousness. That sometimes things happen without our conscious awareness of it. Things can happen without the brain being involved or controlling it. So, for example, as we see in the graphic here, in this simple hand withdrawal reflex, information is carried from the skin receptors along the neuron here to the spinal cord. From there, it is passed to the interneurons, to the motor neurons that lead the muscles in the hand and arm. So what this is basically indicating is this. If something all of a sudden gives you a pain response, your hand will almost magically, it seems, automatically pull itself back. You may realize it's happening and not know for sure why it's happening until a little bit later when your brain sort of catches up. Certain reflexes, reflexology, so to speak, can bypass the brain. The brain may get the after-action report, but it was not required in the decision to pull the hand back. Have you ever accidentally put your hand on a hot stove in your grandmother's kitchen, for example, and then all of a sudden you feel your hand pulling back, and then you feel the pain from the burn? Well, that happened without you consciously controlling it because of the reflex. So for certain things, the decision, quote, is made at the spinal cord level, that it will respond in a reflexive manner to stop the body from getting too much injury to itself. So we're designed to do that as well. You become aware of it a little bit later when you see sort of the after action report as it's already happened. Again, we'll talk more about that a little bit later too in a future chapter. Next, we talk about the endocrine system. The endocrine system is the slow chemical communication system. We've talked about the nervous system, which is very, very fast. The nervous system is email and text messaging. The endocrine system is snail mail, post office mail. Put a letter in the mailbox mail. So the slow chemical communication system is a set of glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. These hormones are chemically very similar to neurotransmitters that we talked about previously in the neuron section. So the hormones are these chemical substances that can be passed through the bloodstream to other parts of the body and other glands. The adrenal glands, they secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. We have pituitary glands. The pituitary gland secretes many different hormones, some of which affect other glands, sort of considered to be the master gland. We have the parathyroids, the pancreas, and of course the ones that we are familiar with to some degree, the ovaries for females and testes for males. They secrete sex hormones, which will become a particularly important thing when we go through puberty. We'll see this a little bit later as well in a future chapter as well about what happens as we go through puberty, where sex hormones become very, very important. Sex hormones are also tied and linked in our early prenatal development too, and we'll talk about that in a future chapter as well. So we have all of these glands located throughout parts of the body, and they secrete these hormones that travel through the blood to cause certain effects in the body that will help to allow us to live, allow us to metabolize things, allow us to function more properly. And of course, When there are issues with these glands and the hormones they produce, it can cause some diseases and disorders. So, the feedback system reveals the intimate connection between the nervous and endocrine system. So we have this brain, and part of the brain we have the pituitary gland, which is also part of the endocrine system. The brain to the pituitary gland, then to the other glands that secrete other hormones that will then influence the body and the brain. So what we have here is a cycle, a feedback loop. So the brain controls things that will control the glands that releases the hormones that will have an influence on the body and then also control the brain. So the nervous system directs the endocrine secretions, which then affect the nervous system. Conducting and coordinating this whole electrochemical system is the flexible brain. The brain is a powerful thing, one of the best tools that we have ever been able to possess. Now, the tools of discovery, having our head examined. Before we get into a great deal of detail about the brain, let's talk about a few things before we wrap up this first section. New generation of neural map makers. We selectively lesion and observe brain function. Oftentimes, in the early parts of psychology and the discovery of what the brain actually does, they were able to discover certain brain functions in certain areas of the brain because people behaved oddly. And when they behave oddly, maybe they could not speak a certain way, or they had some issue pronouncing things, and they thought maybe there was some issue with them mentally. Well, when that person would die, they would look at their brain, and then they would compare that person's brain with other people's brain, and they were able to identify areas of the brain that seemingly had relationships to certain types of functions. Electrically, chemically, or magnetically, we can stimulate brain parts and note the effects. I mean, they can do things. Oftentimes, when people have brain surgery, they're going to be conscious and awake. And they will stimulate the brain and then ask the person what they're experiencing. And there's a video, too, I believe, that will demonstrate something similar to that. We can detect an electrical pulse to a single neuron, view color representation of brain energy consumption, with the premise there being when a brain is consuming energy, the part of the brain that's lighting up and that is consuming that energy must be related to whatever function or activity the person is doing at that time. So in that way, we can discover quite a bit about what part of the brain is functioning when we're doing certain types of activities. Now, the tools of discovery, having our head examined. Types of neural measures, okay? First of all, let's look at these two pictures here, A and B. Note the enlarged ventricle, the fluid-filled brain region at the tip of the arrow in the image on the right. See, it's like a little butterfly in the center of the brain. It's much larger than the one on the left. Okay? Well, basically, what this is demonstrating is the brain on the right is shrinking. It's deteriorating in some way, and that's why the ventricles are so big. The brain is shrinking. It can be done for a variety of reasons. We see that this can happen when you have someone who may be suffering from a great deal of alcohol abuse. The brain can start to shrink in that instance too. There are other diseases and disorders too in which that can happen. But what this does, it opens up a whole bunch of possibilities when it comes to tools that are used to examine the brain. And this led to basically a revolution in the sense of looking at the brain and trying to find out how the brain's activities is related to certain types of behaviors and things that we do and how we process things. So let's look at some of these. We have the EEG, or the electroencephalogram, an amplified recording of the waves of electrical activity sweeping across the brain surface. These waves are measured by electrodes placed on the scalp. We have the MEG, the magnetoencephalography, brain imaging technique that measures magnetic fields from the brain's natural electrical activity. We have PET, or the PET scan, positron emission tomography scan. visual display of the brain activity that detects where a radioactive form of glucose goes where the brain performs a given task. So they can see what part of the brain is utilizing that sugar, and they can track it because they've made it radioactive. They can see it function, see what brain part is being utilized as a person does a certain task. And then we have the more familiar MRI, the magnetic resonance imaging, a technique that uses magnetic fields and radio waves to produce computer-generated images of soft tissue. MRI scans can show brain anatomy. And then the fMRI, functional MRI, a technique for revealing blood flow and therefore brain activity by comparing successive MRI scans. fMRI scans show brain function as well as structure. So with the fMRI, we can see what parts of the brain are being lit up, so to speak, as we're doing certain types of tasks. Again, we're then able to identify easily what part of the brain is utilized in certain types of functions and certain types of activities. We'll end there for now.